His hand was already around her throat when he saw the ring. "You got pregnant?" Cooper hissed, fingers tightening as Melissa gasped for air, one hand shielding her belly, and that's when the cafe door opened. The man walking in didn't shout. He didn't run. But when he said, "Take your hand off my wife," the entire room went silent because Cooper had just put his hands on Pedro Feliciano's world. And Pedro never leaves threats unfinished. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. The latte had gone cold, but Melissa kept her palm flat against the ceramic anyway. It was a habit she'd developed somewhere between the woman she used to be and the woman she was still becoming, this need to hold on to warmth even after it had already left. Her therapist would probably say something meaningful about that. Melissa hadn't mentioned it yet. Some revelations felt too private to hand over, even to someone paid to receive them. The cafe off Meridian Avenue moved around her in the easy, unhurried way of a Tuesday afternoon. Pendant lights hung low over polished wooden tables, casting pools of amber across the room. The smell of espresso and warm pastry drifted from the counter. Soft conversation filled the space, nothing urgent, nothing sharp, the kind of atmosphere Pedro had chosen deliberately when he suggested they meet here. Discreet, comfortable, far enough from his usual world that his mother could relax over coffee without a security rotation making her feel like a target. Melissa shifted in her chair and felt the familiar ache press into her lower back. 5 months. The swell of her stomach was beyond hiding now, not that she tried. Her soft gray cardigan hung open over her white blouse, and her right hand rested instinctively over her belly, the way it always did now, without instruction, without thought. Her body had developed its own language of protection before her mind had caught up. Her laptop sat open on the table beside an untouched cup and a phone she'd already checked 3 times. Pedro had texted 15 minutes ago, running 10 minutes late. "Mama is asking what you ordered. Tell her you had the almond croissant. It'll make her happy." She had not ordered the almond croissant. She had smiled anyway. She turned back to her screen, a half-drafted message to the pediatrician's office about the next appointment, and tried to concentrate. Around her, the cafe carried on. A young couple argued quietly near the window. A man in the corner read a newspaper with the kind of focus only retired people manage. A child at a table by the entrance kicked his feet rhythmically against his chair while his mother scrolled her phone, unbothered. Melissa caught her reflection faintly in the dark glass of her laptop screen. Dark hair falling past her shoulders, tired eyes, but not the hollow kind, the full kind, the kind that comes from carrying something real. Her ring caught the pendant light above and threw a small glint across the table. She touched it without thinking. A reflex she hadn't managed to stop, and no longer wanted to. 8 months ago, Pedro had slid it onto her finger without ceremony, without spectacle. Just the 2 of them, and a handful of the people who mattered most to him, in a room that smelled of white flowers and candle wax. He had looked at her like she was something that made sense to him, like she was an answer he'd been patient enough to wait for. She hadn't known what to do with being looked at that way. She was still learning. The ache in her back sharpened briefly. She rolled her shoulders and reached for the cold latte more out of something to do with her hands than any real thirst. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sat gray and still. A woman passed on the pavement with a stroller, head down against the wind. Melissa exhaled slowly. This was the life she had built from the rubble of the one before it. Quiet afternoons. A man who texted her about croissants. A baby pressing warmly against her ribs. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was simply hers. And she was still, even now, quietly surprised each morning that no one was coming to dismantle it. She should have known better than to think that on a Tuesday, the cafe door opened. She didn't look up. She was reaching across the table to close her laptop, eyes down, fingers already moving toward the trackpad. When the shift happened, not a sound exactly, not a movement, but a change in the quality of the air itself. Something that dropped the temperature by a degree she couldn't measure but felt immediately, in the back of her neck and the flat of her palm still pressed against the cold cup. Then the voice came. "Melissa." 3 syllables. That was all. But they landed the way a blade lands precise, without warning, finding the exact place that was still unguarded. She had not heard that voice in 14 months. She had not wanted to. She had constructed her entire new life around the deliberate absence of it. New routines, new circles, A new name she wore like armor she no longer had to think about putting on. And still, in the space of a breath, every muscle in her body remembered what it had meant to be a woman who answered to Cooper Scott. She looked up slowly. He stood less than 6 feet from her table. A navy suit cut close across broad shoulders he had always kept deliberately impressive. Dark hair combed back from a clean-shaved face. He was groomed the way men are groomed when control is the point, every edge managed, every detail intentional. His eyes found her face first, then they dropped. He stared at her stomach. The cafe noise continued around them, orders called, spoons against cups, the low drift of other people's ordinary afternoons, but the space between Melissa and Cooper went completely silent. She felt the nearest table glance over and look away again. The child by the entrance stopped kicking his feet. Cooper's expression, when his gaze finally returned to hers, was not shock. Shock passes. What moved across his face was something that had already begun curdling before he'd finished processing what he was looking at. Something hot and ugly working itself up from beneath the groomed surface of him, the way it always had. His jaw tightened. His right hand, the one with the old scar across the knuckle, curled slowly at his side. "You got pregnant?" His voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. The precise register she had once learned to dread more than shouting. Melissa's hand pressed flat and firm against her belly. Her eyes did not drop. They did not fill. They held his with the steady calm of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side knowing exactly what fire looked like. But her pulse said something different. And somewhere beyond the tall glass panels of the entrance behind him, headlights swept slowly across the wet pavement outside. Pedro was 10 minutes away. Melissa needed 10 minutes. She was not at all certain she had them. She had spent 4 years believing the failure was hers. 4 years folding herself smaller around a man who handed her his shame and called it truth. The story of how she had arrived at this cafe, at this ring, at this child, at this life, began long before Pedro, long before the courage it took to file those papers and walk away. It began with Cooper Scott, and it would end with him too, just not the way either of them expected. Melissa stood slowly, not from fear. She'd made a promise to herself the day she signed the divorce papers that she would never again move quickly around Cooper Scott. Never flinch, never shrink, never give him the satisfaction of watching her scramble. She rose from the wooden chair with deliberate calm, one hand still resting over her stomach, and met his eyes with the kind of steadiness that took 14 months of therapy and a man like Pedro to build. "It's none of your business, Cooper." Something flickered behind his eyes. He had always hated that being dismissed, being made to feel irrelevant. She had learned that too late in the marriage and just early enough to survive it. He stepped closer. "You couldn't get pregnant with me?" His voice dropped lower. The words pressed out through his teeth like something he'd been holding since the moment he'd seen her belly. 4 years. 4 years, Melissa. And now you're... He stopped. His jaw worked. "How long? How long were you with him before I was even out the door? You need to leave. Answer me. Lower your voice." He laughed a short, airless sound with nothing warm in it. "Lower my voice." He repeated it like it was the most absurd thing he'd ever heard. His eyes swept the cafe briefly, registering the faces turned toward them. And then he looked back at her, with the particular expression she remembered most clearly from the worst years. The one that said the audience didn't matter. That what happened between them existed outside the rules that applied to everyone else. He stepped closer still. Melissa held her ground. "You planned this." The words came out quietly now, which was worse. Quiet Cooper was always worse than loud Cooper. "You knew. You knew the whole time that you could get pregnant, and you let me believe. You let me think that you never got tested." Her voice was steady. "I asked you, twice. The doctors asked you. You refused." His face twisted. "You're lying. I'm not. You humiliated me." The words broke open on the last syllable, and for one moment she saw it, the raw, disorganized thing underneath all the tailoring and control. Not grief. Not love. Wounded pride wearing grief's clothing. "You left me and now you're carrying another man's child and you think you can sit here?" He moved before she could process it. One moment he was standing. The next his hand was around her throat. Not tight enough to cut air completely, enough to pin, enough to control, enough to drag her back to every room in the house, where he had made her feel like she was only as real as his anger allowed. He leaned down to her seated level, his face inches from hers, the navy suit jacket pulling across his shoulders with the effort of it. His other hand landed on the table with a crack that silenced the nearest tables entirely. "You think this pregnancy will last?" His voice was barely above a whisper now. "You think you'll be happy? You think you get to just walk away from 4 years and come out ahead?" Melissa's hand flew to her stomach. She couldn't get a full breath. She pressed her palm flat against her belly, a reflex, a prayer, and forced herself to keep her eyes open, keep them on his face, keep herself present in her body rather than retreating to the familiar, terrible distance she'd once used to survive moments like this. The child by the entrance had started crying. No one in the cafe moved. The specific paralysis of bystanders, that terrible collective freeze where everyone is waiting for someone else to be the first, held the room in suspension. A woman near the window had her hand over her mouth. A barista stood motionless behind the counter with a portafilter in his hand. Melissa pulled a thin breath through the pressure of Cooper's grip. She did not beg. And then the door opened. The cold air came first, a brief rush of it, sweeping through the warmth of the cafe. Then footsteps. Measured, unhurried, the kind that belonged to a man who has never needed to announce himself, because rooms have always known to pay attention. Pedro entered, black suit, no tie. The collar of his shirt open at the throat, revealing the edge of the ink that climbed his neck, dark, deliberate lines that disappeared beneath the fabric. He was broad-shouldered and composed, his dark eyes moving across the room with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to reading situations at a glance. His mother stepped in behind him, already unwinding her scarf, already beginning to smile. The smile died. Pedro's gaze found Melissa, found Cooper's hand at her throat, found her palm pressed against her stomach. Everything changed. Not loudly. There was no shout, no dramatic shift in his expression. That was the part that would stay with everyone in that cafe long after the afternoon was over, how still he became. How the temperature of the entire room seemed to drop a degree in the second before he moved. He crossed the cafe in 6 strides. He took Cooper by the collar with one hand, as if the man weighed nothing, and drove him backward into the stone pillar beside the nearest table. The sound it made was dense and final, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had gone on far too long. The cafe gasped. Cooper grabbed at Pedro's wrist. Pedro didn't move. "Take your hand off my wife." His voice was low, absolute, the kind of calm that isn't calm at all, but something colder and more dangerous operating underneath it. Cooper blinked, staggered, looked at the man holding him against a pillar, and tried, visibly, to locate his footing. Who are you?" Pedro looked at him, the way a man looks at something he has already decided how to handle. Her husband. The word hit the room like a stone hitting water. Cooper's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and something that was beginning, finally, to look like fear. Pedro's mother was already at Melissa's side, her warm hands cupping Melissa's face, checking her neck, her eyes, her breathing, speaking softly in a language Melissa was still learning but understood well enough in moments like this. "You're safe. I have you. He cannot touch you." Pedro leaned close to Cooper. "If you ever put your hands on her again," he said quietly, "you won't have hands." He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. The private clinic smelled of antiseptic and fresh linen. Melissa sat on the examination table with a paper sheet crackling softly beneath her every time she moved, her cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the small monitor beside the bed. The technician had already confirmed what Pedro needed to hear. The baby was fine, heartbeat strong and steady, entirely unbothered by the afternoon his mother had just survived. Pedro stood in the corner of the room with his arms folded and his jaw set, watching the screen with an expression that said he would not fully exhale until the doctor said the word "perfect" out loud. The doctor said it. Pedro exhaled. Melissa said nothing. She lay there listening to the rhythmic pulse of her child's heartbeat through the monitor speakers and felt, underneath the relief, something else begin to surface. Something old and heavy and familiar, loosened by the afternoon the way a stone is loosened by water slowly. Then all at once, she had been here before. Not this clinic, not this table, but this particular combination of fluorescent light and medical equipment and the sound of a heartbeat being searched for. She had been here many times before, with different results. With a different man standing in the corner. Pedro noticed her silence on the drive home and didn't fill it with words. That was one of the things she had learned about him earliest. He understood the difference between a silence that needed company and a silence that needed space. He rested his hand over hers on the center console and kept his eyes on the road, and that was enough. That night, after his mother had retired to the guest room and the apartment had settled into quiet, Melissa sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking and let the memories come. She had been 26 when she married Cooper Scott. She had loved him the way young women love men who are certain completely, and with a trust she had not yet learned to portion carefully. He had been charming in the early years, attentive, the kind of man who remembered small things, who made her feel chosen, who spoke about the future with such easy confidence that she had believed, genuinely, that his certainty extended to her. They started trying for a baby in the second year of marriage. It had felt exciting at first, hopeful. She remembered the optimism of those early months, the tracking apps, the vitamins, the careful scheduling that still managed to feel romantic because they were doing it together, because the trying was an act of wanting something shared. Then the months became a year. The doctor appointments started. Blood work, hormone panels, an HSG test that left her cramping on the examination table while Cooper waited in the car because hospitals made him uncomfortable. Everything came back within normal range. The doctor suggested they test Cooper next. Cooper refused. "I know I'm fine," he said that evening, loosening his tie at the kitchen counter, not looking at her. "There's no point." She had tried to reason with him. Once, twice, 4 times over the following months, each conversation ending the same way, with Cooper's patience thinning, his certainty hardening, his willingness to discuss it closing like a door being pulled firmly shut. And then the cruelty started. Not all at once. That was the thing about the way Cooper operated. It was never sudden enough to be undeniable. It arrived in increments. A comment here, a withdrawal there. The way he stopped reaching for her hand in public. The way he began referring to her body with a clinical detachment that made her feel like a faulty appliance he was still deciding whether to return. "You knew something was wrong with you before we got married, didn't you?" She remembered exactly where she'd been standing when he said it. At the sink, washing the dinner dishes, steam rising from the water. She had gone completely still. "That's not true." "Then why can't you give me a child?" The words had rearranged something inside her. Not broken it, not yet, but shifted it. Moved something fundamental out of alignment in the way that a single wrong step on uneven ground shifts your balance before you've even registered the fall. Over the following months, he called her useless. He said it quietly, conversationally, the way you might comment on the weather. He withdrew from their bed. He told her once, during an argument she no longer remembered the origin of, that she had tricked him, that she had known, and said nothing, and let him commit to a life she was incapable of giving him. She had carried that word for a long time. Tricked. As though love were a transaction. As though she had sat across from him in those early hopeful months, and calculated what she could take before he noticed what she lacked. She had started sleeping poorly, eating irregularly. She lost weight she hadn't intended to lose, and gained a quietness that her closest friends noticed, and she denied. She stopped calling her mother as often, because her mother would have heard it in her voice, and she wasn't ready to say it out loud that her marriage was not what she had believed it was. That the man she had loved with such complete and uncalculated trust had decided the problem was her, and was no longer interested in considering otherwise. She filed for divorce on a Wednesday morning in March. Cooper had signed the papers with a pen he'd brought himself, leaning over the solicitor's desk with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his own position. He had looked at her across the table afterward with something that was almost a smile. "You'll regret this," he said. She had said nothing. She had gathered her copy of the papers, placed them in her bag, walked out of the building, and stood on the pavement in the thin March sunshine, and waited to feel something definitive. What came instead was quieter than she expected. Not relief, not grief. Just the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and has finally, at great cost, been allowed to put it down. She hadn't known then that the heaviest part, the shame, the belief that she was broken, the 4 years of accumulated damage done to the way she understood herself, would take much longer to set down. She hadn't known yet about Pedro. She hadn't known yet about the truth her own body was still waiting to tell her. She met Pedro Feliciano on an ordinary Thursday. No dramatic circumstances. No rain-soaked street corner or crowded bar where eyes meet across a room and the world slows down to accommodate the moment. It was a Thursday afternoon in September, 6 months after the divorce, at a small gallery opening a colleague had dragged her to because Melissa had declined 3 previous invitations, and goodwill has a limit. She hadn't wanted to be there. She had stood near the back with a glass of white wine she wasn't drinking, wearing a dress she'd bought for a version of herself she was still trying to locate looking at a large, abstract canvas that meant nothing to her and trying to appear as though it did. "It doesn't work," a voice said beside her. She turned. He was standing 2 feet away, also looking at the canvas. A glass of water, not wine, held loosely in one hand. Dark suit, no tie. Broad shoulders, unhurried posture. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from passivity but from a man who has long since stopped feeling the need to perform composure because it is simply what he is. She noticed the ink at his collar before she noticed his face. Dark lines climbing the side of his neck, disappearing beneath his shirt. She looked away quickly, then back. "The painting," he added, as though she'd asked. "The scale is wrong for the emotion it's trying to carry. Too wide. It dilutes it." She looked at the canvas again. "I thought it was just me," she said. He glanced at her then. Dark eyes, direct without being aggressive. "It's not just you." That was how it started. They talked for 40 minutes in front of a painting neither of them liked. And then he asked if she wanted to get coffee somewhere that wasn't this gallery, and she had said yes before she'd fully decided to. They walked 3 blocks to a quieter place and sat across from each other at a corner table and kept talking. And at no point during those 2 hours did Melissa feel the specific alertness she had grown accustomed to around men, that low-level monitoring, the constant background calculation of how much space she was taking up, whether her voice was too much, whether she was saying the wrong thing and would pay for it later in some quiet, deniable way. With Pedro, she simply talked. He listened the way very few people listen, not waiting for his turn, not constructing his response while she was still mid-sentence, but actually receiving what she said and sitting with it before he answered. It was disarming in a way she hadn't anticipated and didn't quite know what to do with. They saw each other again the following week, and the week after that. It was on the 4th meeting dinner this time. A small Italian place he'd chosen because the owner knew him and they could speak without interruption that she told him about the marriage. She hadn't planned to. It came out the way things come out when you are finally in the presence of someone who makes you feel safe enough to be honest gradually. Then with a rush she couldn't stop once it started. She told him about the trying, the doctor visits, the negative tests, the way hope had slowly curdled into something she no longer recognized. She told him about Cooper's refusal to be tested. She told him about the word defective, spoken in the kitchen of a house she had believed was a home. She told him about the divorce and the March pavement and the exhaustion that had followed her out of the solicitor's office, like a second shadow. She told him all of it, and then sat across from him in the low light of the restaurant, waiting for the thing she had learned to expect, the slight withdrawal, the recalibration, the moment when a man's interest quietly adjusts itself around the complicated facts of who she actually was. Pedro was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He never got tested." "No, and you carried 4 years of his refusal as though it were your diagnosis." It wasn't a question. She felt something shift in her chest at the precision of it, the way he had located the exact wound without being directed to it. "Yes," she said quietly. He looked at her steadily. "If you can't have children, we build a family another way. That's not a sacrifice, that's just a different door." He paused. "And if you can, then the truth is, you were simply with the wrong man." She had not cried in front of someone in over a year. She came very close to it then. She didn't. She pressed her lips together and looked down at her hands on the table and breathed through it. And when she looked back up, he had not moved, had not looked away, was simply there, present and unhurried, and entirely unfrightened by the weight of what she'd shared. She filed that moment away carefully. She would return to it many times. They married 11 months after the gallery, quietly, as Pedro did everything. A small ceremony, people who mattered, white flowers and candlelight and a ring slid onto her finger by a man who had never once made her feel that her worth was conditional on what her body could produce. 3 months after the wedding, she was late. She bought the test alone, on a Tuesday morning, in a pharmacy 3 streets from their apartment. She took it in the bathroom with the door locked even though she was alone in the flat. And she sat on the edge of the bath and stared at the result for a very long time before she believed it. 2 lines. She pressed her hand over her mouth. And then she cried, not quietly, not carefully, but with the full, unguarded release of a woman receiving the confirmation of something she had been told, repeatedly and cruelly, she would never have. Great, heaving sobs that shook her shoulders and soaked her palms, and had nothing to do with sadness, and everything to do with the 4 years of shame finally, irrevocably, being disproven. The problem had never been her. It had never been her. When Pedro came home that evening, she met him in the hallway with the test still in her hand. He looked at it, then at her face, Then he pulled her into him without a word and held her there while she cried again, his hand steady at the back of her head. He didn't say "I told you so." He didn't need to. The bruises on Melissa's neck faded within a week. The ones no one could see took considerably longer. She told herself she was fine. She told Pedro she was fine. She told his mother, who had extended her visit by 4 days without being asked, and had taken to appearing in the kitchen each morning with herbal tea and a particular look that required no translation, that she was absolutely fine and that everyone needed to stop watching her as though she might shatter. She was not fine. She knew it the way you know a hairline fracture, before the X-ray confirms it by the way ordinary movement suddenly costs more than it should. She would be doing something unremarkable, washing her face, or folding laundry, or sitting with her laptop in the afternoon light, and then a sound would reach her, a door closing too firmly, a raised voice from somewhere outside, and her hand would fly to her stomach before her mind had even registered the threat. Her body remembered the cafe. Her body was going to remember it for a long time. Pedro noticed. He said nothing directly, which was his way. He did not pry, did not push, did not require her to perform recovery on a schedule that suited him. But she caught him watching her sometimes with that particular stillness of his, the kind that meant he was measuring something, calculating quietly behind those dark eyes, and she noticed, without him mentioning it, that there was always someone outside the building now when she left, a man she didn't recognize, reading a newspaper or standing near a car with the particular quality of alertness that belonged to people paid to pay attention. She didn't ask about it. She understood what it meant. Cooper, meanwhile, had not disappeared. She had hoped naively. She understood now that the warehouse of Pedro's presence in that cafe would have been enough. That whatever Cooper had seen in Pedro's face when he crossed that room would have activated the basic self-preservation instinct and sent him quietly in the other direction. She had underestimated how much Cooper's pride could override his judgment. It started with mutual acquaintances. A woman they'd both known during the marriage, a friend of Cooper's wife-era social circle, sent Melissa a careful, apologetic message informing her that Cooper had been talking, telling people that the pregnancy wasn't what it appeared to be, that Melissa had been involved with someone else before the divorce was finalized, that the timeline didn't add up. Melissa read the message twice, set her phone face down on the kitchen counter, and stood there for a moment with both hands pressed flat against the cool marble. Then she picked the phone back up and replied with 2 words. "Thank you," she told Pedro that evening. He was at the kitchen table when she came in, a glass of water untouched beside a folder of papers he wasn't reading. He looked up when she entered, and something in her face made him close the folder immediately. She told him what Cooper was saying, about the rumors, the insinuations about the baby's paternity, the careful, deniable way Cooper was rewriting the story to position himself as the wronged party, the man whose wife had betrayed him, rather than the man who had strangled a pregnant woman in a cafe in front of 20 witnesses. Pedro listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "He's scared," Pedro said. "He's lying." "Yes, because he's scared." Pedro's voice carried no heat. It was observational, almost clinical, as though he were describing the behavior of something he'd encountered before and found entirely predictable. Men like Cooper don't go quiet when they're embarrassed. They get louder. They reframe. They make enough noise that the original story gets buried under the revision. Melissa sat down across from him. "What do we do?" "Nothing. Yet." He met her eyes. "You don't respond to rumors. Responding gives them weight." She nodded slowly. She trusted his instincts in ways she was still getting used to. Not blindly, not without question, but with the specific trust of a woman who has watched a man be consistently, quietly right about the things that matter. But the rumors were only the beginning. A colleague of Melissa's, a woman from the translation agency she occasionally contracted with, mentioned in passing that someone had been asking questions. Not officially, not with any authority. "Just a man," she said, "well-dressed. Friendly in that deliberate way that means the friendliness is instrumental. Asking about Melissa's schedule, what hours she kept, whether she drove or took public transport to her appointments." Melissa felt the cold move through her before the woman had finished the sentence. She called Pedro from the pavement outside the agency building, her hand cupped over her phone against the wind, and told him what she'd heard. There was a brief silence on his end, 3 seconds, maybe 4, of the particular quality of quiet that preceded Pedro making a decision. "Go straight home," he said. "Don't stop anywhere. I'll send Rodrigo to walk up with you from the car." "Pedro." "Melissa." His voice was gentle but absolute. "Please." She went straight home. That evening, Pedro came in later than usual, said little over dinner, and afterward sat in his study for 2 hours with the door closed. She didn't disturb him. She had learned to read the architecture of his silences, which ones were processing, which ones were planning, which ones meant something had shifted in the world beyond their apartment walls, and he was deciding what to do about it. This one was planning. 2 days later, one of Pedro's men came to him with a report. Melissa was in the living room when she heard the low exchange in the hallway, too quiet to make out, but with a tone that made her set down her book and sit very still. Pedro appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not worry exactly, but the focused, controlled intensity of a man confronting information that has changed the shape of a problem. "What is it?" she asked. He crossed the room and sat beside her. "Cooper has gambling debts," he said quietly. "Significant ones. And the men he owes money to are not the kind of men who wait patiently." She stared at him. "There's more." Pedro's jaw tightened slightly. "He's been in contact with people I know. Not friends. The other kind." The room felt smaller suddenly. "The cafe wasn't just anger," Pedro said. "He was trying to provoke something, create leverage." He paused. "This wasn't random, Melissa." She felt the cold settle into her bones. Outside the apartment window, the city carried on indifferent, unhurried, entirely unaware that the afternoon in the cafe had not been an ending at all. It had been an opening move. Pedro didn't sleep that night. Melissa knew because she didn't either. She lay in the dark beside him, listening to his breathing, measured, controlled, but not the slow cadence of a man at rest. He was awake and thinking, and somewhere in the careful architecture of his mind, decisions were being made that he wasn't ready to share with her yet. She didn't press him. She stared at the ceiling and felt the baby shift against her ribs, and thought about leverage. The word kept returning to her. Cooper had gone to that cafe with a purpose beyond rage. That was the part her mind kept circling, kept pressing on the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, not because pressing helped, but because the shape of it was still so difficult to accept. She had spent 14 months constructing a narrative in which Cooper was simply a damaged, angry man who had handled rejection badly. A man whose cruelty was born from insecurity rather than calculation. The idea that it might be both, that a man could be genuinely wounded and genuinely predatory at the same time, sat in her chest like something she didn't yet have a word for. She fell asleep somewhere near 3 in the morning. When she woke, Pedro was already gone from the bed. She found him in the kitchen, dressed, 2 cups of coffee on the table, and his phone face down beside them. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and whatever he saw in her face made him pull out the chair across from him without speaking. She sat. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Tell me everything," she said. He did. Cooper's debts, Pedro explained, were not recent. They had accumulated over 3 years through a combination of private card games and loans from men who operated in the spaces between legitimate business and the kind of enterprise that didn't file tax returns. The total figure when Pedro said it made Melissa set her cup down carefully. "He's been hiding that the entire time," she said. "People hide what they're ashamed of. He made me feel ashamed for 4 years. The words came out quietly, without heat. While he was doing this, Pedro said nothing. He didn't need to. The steadiness of his gaze said everything about what he thought of that particular irony. The men Cooper owed money to had connections, lateral, indirect, deliberately obscured to a syndicate that Pedro knew well. Not allies, not enemies. The complicated middle ground that existed in his world between those 2 categories, where relationships were maintained through mutual restraint and the understanding that certain lines existed for everyone's benefit. Cooper had apparently decided those lines didn't apply to him. By approaching them, Pedro said, he was signaling that he had something to offer. Something worth their investment in whatever he was planning. "Me," Melissa said flatly. Pedro's jaw tightened. "You, the pregnancy, my name." He paused. "All of it." She absorbed that. She sat with it the way she had learned to sit with difficult things, without rushing toward a reaction, without letting the feeling capsize the thought. She pressed her palm against her stomach beneath the table, feeling the warmth of her own hand against the swell of it, and breathed. "What do we do?" she asked. "We already started," he said. She looked at him. "I have people watching him. His movements, his contacts, his communications where we can access them." He said it without apology, without drama, the way someone else might describe checking a weather forecast. I needed to understand the full shape of it before I moved. She nodded slowly. She had married a man who operated in a world with its own rules, its own architecture of consequence and response. She had known that going in had asked him once, early in their relationship, whether she needed to be afraid of what he did, and he had answered her with the honesty she respected. Not of what I do, only of what I do it to. She had believed him then. She believed him now. 3 days passed. On the 4th day, 2 men were intercepted 4 blocks from the building. Pedro told her that evening, sitting across from her at the kitchen table in the same configuration that had become, she realized, the geography of every serious conversation they'd had since the cafe. His expression was controlled, but she had learned to read the things that lived underneath his control. The slight tension along his jaw, the quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness, tighter, more deliberate. They were following you, he said. They've been on your route for at least 2 days. The pharmacy on Tuesday. The clinic appointment on Thursday. The clinic appointment. She felt the cold move through her in a wave. They were watching me at the clinic, she said. Yes. She pressed both hands against her stomach this time. Not a reflex, a conscious act. A deliberate claiming of the space her child occupied, as though the pressure of her palms could form a barrier between her baby and a world that had apparently decided to use him as currency. Cooper, she said. Cooper, Pedro confirmed. She looked at him. How do you know it was him? Because I asked them, Pedro said simply. She didn't ask what that had looked like. She found in that moment that she didn't need to. She found that 14 months ago, she might have been disturbed by the absence of detail, by the calm with which he delivered information that implied a significant amount of pressure had been applied to produce it. But 14 months ago, she had also believed that the failure of her marriage was biological and personal and entirely her fault. She had revised a great many beliefs since then. Cooper had hired men to follow a pregnant woman to her medical appointments. That was what he had done. She let that sit in the room between them for a moment, the full, unvarnished shape of it, stripped of context and justification, and the long history that people use to soften the edges of what they know. Then she looked at Pedro. You said you needed to understand the full shape of it before you moved, she said quietly. Do you understand it now? Pedro held her gaze. Yes, he said. She nodded once. Then do what needs to be done. She rose from the table, placed her cup in the sink, and walked to the bedroom without looking back. She heard, faintly, the sound of Pedro reaching for his phone. And somewhere across the city, a well-dressed man in a navy suit received an invitation he had not expected and could not refuse. Cooper arrived at the docks at 9 o'clock. Melissa didn't know this at the time. She was at home, sitting in the armchair by the bedroom window with a book open in her lap that she hadn't read a single page of, listening to the city settle into its nighttime register, the distant percussion of traffic, the occasional voice from the street below, the particular quality of quiet that a city produces after 10 when the urgent part of the day has finally exhausted itself. She had told Pedro to do what needed to be done. She had meant it. But sitting alone in the lamplight with her child pressing gently against her ribs, she found that meaning something and living inside the consequences of it were 2 different experiences entirely. She turned a page she hadn't read and tried to breathe evenly. Cooper had dressed for the meeting the way he dressed for everything, as though appearance were armor. Dark trousers, fitted jacket, shoes that caught the light. He had received the invitation through an intermediary. A brief and businesslike message that suggested a conversation about mutual interests and named a location and a time with the kind of quiet authority that didn't leave room for negotiation. He had told himself, on the drive over, that he still had leverage. He had told himself that Pedro Feliciano was a man like any other man, that beneath the reputation and the money and the ink climbing his throat was someone who could be reasoned with, bargained with, brought to a position of compromise if approached correctly. Cooper had always believed he was very good at approaching things correctly. He walked into the warehouse with his shoulders back and his jaw set, and he understood immediately, in the way the body understands things before the mind has finished arguing, that he had made a series of very significant miscalculations. The space was large and dim, lit by a single overhead source that created a pool of light in the center of the room and left the peripheries in shadow. The shadows were not empty. Cooper could sense rather than see the people standing in them still, unhurried, positioned with the deliberate geometry of men who had done this before and found it unremarkable. Pedro stood in the center of the light. No jacket this time. Dark shirt, sleeves pushed to the elbows, the tattoos on his forearms visible, dense, elaborate work that disappeared under the rolled fabric. He had his hands in his pockets, and his expression was the same one Cooper had seen in the cafe. Not angry, not performing menace, simply present in the particular way of a man who has already decided how everything in this room is going to proceed and is now simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Cooper stopped 6 feet from him. He opened his mouth. Pedro spoke first. "You touched my wife." He said it the way someone states a fact in a document, without inflection, without pause, with the particular weight of something being recorded. In a public place, in front of witnesses, with your hand around her throat. Cooper's prepared speech rearranged itself somewhere in his chest. She provoked, "You hired men to follow her." Pedro continued as though Cooper hadn't spoken. "To her medical appointments, to the clinic where she goes for prenatal care." A pause. "You put surveillance on a pregnant woman." The word surveillance in Pedro's mouth sounded different than it would have in anyone else's. Clinical. Official. As though it belonged in a ledger of offenses that was being carefully maintained. Cooper felt the first real thread of cold move through him. "I needed information," he said. His voice came out less steady than he'd intended. "You needed leverage," Pedro said. "There's a difference. Leverage implies you had something to trade." He tilted his head slightly. "You don't. I know people. The people you owe money to." Pedro nodded slowly. "Yes, we've spoken." He let that sit for a moment, let Cooper absorb the specific implication of "we've spoken," the casual authority of it, the suggestion that conversations had been had in rooms Cooper would never be invited into, and outcomes had been agreed upon that did not require his input. They send their regards, and their apologies, actually, for the inconvenience. Cooper's mouth went dry. The rehearsed confidence he'd carried through the warehouse doors had not exactly evaporated, it had simply become irrelevant. The way a map becomes irrelevant when you realize you're in a completely different country than the one it charts. Pedro removed his hands from his pockets. He crossed the distance between them slowly, unhurried, and stopped close enough that Cooper had to resist the instinct to step back. This close, the full dimension of him was apparent, not just the physical scale, but something less quantifiable. The absolute absence of performance. A man who had nothing to prove to this room or anyone in it. "Here is what happens now," Pedro said quietly. "You signed the Meridian contracts over to my attorney, the building on Carver Street, and the stake in the logistics company." He paused. "That covers what you owe, partially." Cooper's stomach dropped. "Those are worth." "I know what they're worth. You can't just—" "Cooper," Pedro said his name simply, without sharpness. "Look around this room." Cooper looked. The shadows at the periphery had shifted slightly, not threatening, simply present. A quiet recalibration that reminded him, without a word being spoken, of the precise dimensions of his situation. He looked back at Pedro. "The assets," Pedro continued, "cover the debt and the inconvenience. What covers the rest," he held Cooper's gaze without blinking, "is that you leave. Not the neighborhood, not the city." A pause. "You leave and you don't come back. No contact, no rumors, no messages through mutual acquaintances. No more stories about my wife or my child." His voice dropped slightly on the last two words, not from emotion, but from something more controlled than emotion. "You become someone who used to live here. That's all." Cooper stood very still. The cold that had started as a thread was now something comprehensive and complete, occupying every part of him. He wanted to argue. He wanted to remind Pedro that he had rights, that this was coercion, that none of this was legal or reasonable or proportionate. He said none of it. Because standing in that warehouse in the dim pool of light, Cooper Scott finally, thoroughly, understood something he should have understood the moment Pedro's hand closed around his collar in the cafe. He was not in a room where those words meant anything. He signed the documents an hour later. He booked a flight before midnight. And when Melissa woke the next morning to find Pedro sitting on the edge of the bed in the gray early light, watching her sleep with an expression she had never seen on him before, something quiet and ferocious and deeply, privately tender, she knew without being told that it was over. "Is he gone?" she asked. Pedro reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. "He's gone," he said. Melissa heard Pedro come home at 11:30. She wasn't asleep. She had been lying in the dark with her eyes open and her hand flat against her stomach, listening to the baby's small interior movements, those subtle, oceanic shifts that she still wasn't entirely accustomed to, still found quietly astonishing each time they came. She heard the front door, heard his footsteps in the hallway, heard the particular pause outside the bedroom door that meant he was deciding whether to wake her. She saved him the decision. "I'm awake," she said. He came in. He didn't turn on the overhead light, just the small lamp on his side of the bed, which threw a warm and limited glow across the room. He sat on the edge of the mattress with his back partially to her and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for a long moment he simply sat there in the lamplight looking at the floor. She pushed herself upright against the headboard. She studied the line of his shoulders, the ink on the back of his neck, the way he carried the evening in his posture, not heavily, not guiltily, but with a kind of settled weight that told her he had done what he'd gone to do and had come home having made peace with it. "Is he gone?" she asked. "He's gone." She nodded. She had expected to feel relief immediately, the clean, uncomplicated release of a threat eliminated. What she felt instead was more layered than that. Relief, yes, but underneath it, something that needed to be said. "You could have killed him," she said quietly. Pedro turned to look at her then. His expression was unreadable in the way it sometimes was, not closed exactly, but still, like water that runs deep enough that the surface gives nothing away. "Yes," he said, simply, without pretense. "But you didn't." "No." She held his gaze. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, considering. The way he always considered things before he gave them to her, making sure what he offered was accurate rather than just comforting, "because you don't need that weight on your conscience," he said. "Whatever he did to you, and I know what he did, you are not a woman who wants a man's death as the resolution to her story." He paused. "I know the difference." She felt something move through her chest. Not quite tears, something that lived behind tears, deeper and older than the specific grief of this moment. "You made that choice for me," she said. "I made it with you in mind," he corrected gently. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who moved through the world with a power she was still learning the full dimensions of, who had walked into a warehouse on her behalf and come home without blood on his hands because he had understood without being told, without being asked what she could live with and what she couldn't. She pressed her lips together, and then, quietly, she broke. Not dramatically. Not with the heaving sobs of the bathroom floor when she'd held the positive test. This was different, smaller, and somehow more profound. Tears that came slowly, without announcement, sliding down the sides of her face in the dim lamplight while she sat upright against the headboard with her hands folded in her lap, like a woman receiving something she had waited a very long time for. Pedro moved without hesitation. He crossed to her side of the bed and sat beside her and gathered her carefully, one hand at her back, one at the side of her face, with the specific tenderness of a man holding something he understands to be precious. She let herself be held. "I thought I was broken," she said into his shoulder. The words came out unguarded, stripped of the careful phrasing she usually applied to this particular wound. Raw, direct, the version of the sentence she had never quite said out loud to anyone, including herself, in exactly these words. Pedro's hand stilled against the back of her head. "I know," he said. 4 years. She pulled back slightly to look at him. Her voice was steady now, or trying to be. 4 years I believed him. I genuinely believed that I was the problem, that there was something fundamentally insufficient about me. She shook her head slowly. I rebuilt my entire understanding of myself around a lie a man told me, because he was too proud to walk into a clinic and give a sample. Pedro looked at her with those dark eyes that saw through the surface of things. "You were not broken," he said. "You were with the wrong man." He held her face in both hands with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who wanted to make sure every word landed where it was meant to. There is a profound difference between those two things. And I need you to understand that, not because I'm telling you, but because it's true, because your body proved it, because that child, he moved one hand gently to her stomach, is proof, not of what you lacked, of what you always had. She covered his hand with hers. The tears came again. She didn't fight them this time. She let them run their course in the warm and private quiet of their bedroom, held against a man who had chosen consistently, deliberately, from the very beginning to see her clearly. This was the thing about Pedro that she had struggled, early on, to fully trust. Not his power, not his world, but his consistency. The fact that he had never once wavered in the way he saw her. She had been waiting, in those early months, for the adjustment for the moment, when the reality of who she was caught up with the version of her he seemed to believe in, and he recalibrated accordingly, withdrew, Revised. The revision never came. She understood now that it wasn't coming. She pulled back eventually and wiped her face with the back of her hand and exhaled the long, slow exhale of a woman releasing something she had been holding for years. Not all of it, these things don't leave entirely in a single night, but enough. Enough that the space where the shame had lived felt different. Lighter. Like a room after the windows have been opened. He used to say I tricked him, she said quietly. Pedro's expression shifted, something tightened briefly in his jaw. Into the marriage, she continued. He said I must have known I couldn't conceive and let him commit anyway. Like I had calculated something. Like love was a scheme I'd run on him. Pedro was quiet for a moment. He said that, he said, because it was the only version of the story where he wasn't responsible for anything. He paused. It had nothing to do with you. It never did. It was entirely about him. She nodded slowly. She knew that. She had known it intellectually for some time. But there is a distance between knowing a thing and feeling it land. Feeling it settle into the body and become something she could carry without the weight of it dragging her sideways. Tonight, in this room, in the aftermath of everything, the cafe, the clinic, the warehouse, the years before all of it, she felt it land. Completely. Finally, she leaned her head against his shoulder. The baby moved a gentle, rolling shift beneath her ribs. She smiled at the ceiling despite everything, despite all of it. He kicked, she said softly. Pedro went very still. Then he pressed his hand more firmly against her stomach, waiting. A moment passed. Then another small movement, distinct and purposeful, pressing back against his palm. Something changed in Pedro's face. She watched it happen, watched the controlled, composed man she had married come undone quietly, privately, thoroughly, by the pressure of his son's foot against his hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The morning after felt different. Not easier exactly. Nothing about the preceding weeks had been easy, and the residue of difficulty doesn't lift overnight simply because the immediate threat has been removed. But different. The apartment held a quality of quiet that Melissa hadn't noticed before. A stillness that wasn't the held breath variety of recent weeks, but something more genuinely settled. She moved through the kitchen in the early light making tea, and the ordinary domestic simplicity of it struck her as remarkable, in the way that ordinary things become remarkable once you've spent long enough being afraid they might be taken from you. Pedro's mother, Isadora, was already at the table. She was a compact, sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s who wore her gray hair pinned back and her opinions openly, who had extended her visit twice now without anyone formally inviting her to do so, and had somehow made herself indispensable in the process. She looked up when Melissa appeared in the doorway and assessed her in the particular way she had efficiently, without embarrassment, as though she had both the right and the responsibility to determine how the people she loved were faring. You slept, Isadora said. An observation, not a question. Some, Melissa said. Sit. Melissa sat. Isadora rose and produced a cup of something herbal that smelled of chamomile, and something sharper she didn't recognize, and placed it in front of her with the quiet authority of a woman who has spent decades understanding that care is most effective when it doesn't ask permission. He told me, Isadora said, returning to her own chair. Not everything. He never tells me everything, but enough. Melissa wrapped both hands around the cup. And? Isadora looked at her steadily. And I think you're stronger than you believe yourself to be. I also think, she paused in that deliberate way she had, choosing words with the precision of someone to whom language had always mattered, that you've been measuring your strength by how much you could endure, rather than by what you've built. Melissa looked at her. There's a difference, Isadora added. Pedro says that, Melissa said quietly, that there's a difference. He learned it from somewhere. The older woman's expression softened into something that wasn't quite a smile but lived close to it. Melissa had come to understand Pedro's world gradually, in the way you come to understand a complex piece of music, not all at once, not through explanation, but through repeated exposure until the structure beneath the surface becomes audible. She had known from the beginning that he was powerful. She had understood, in the abstract, what that power meant and where it came from, and what maintaining it required. Living inside it was different from understanding it abstractly. She had expected it to feel like pressure, like living adjacent to something dangerous that required constant awareness. She had expected to feel watched, managed, contained the way she had felt in the marriage to Cooper, where his control had been intimate and personal and dressed up as protection. Pedro's world felt nothing like that. His protection was structural rather than personal. It operated around her rather than over her. He had never once told her where she could go, who she could see, what she was permitted to think or feel or want. He had simply made sure that wherever she went, she was safe. There was a guard outside the building she had learned to nod to in the mornings. There were people whose names she didn't know, who ensured that her route to appointments was clear. It was vast and quiet, and entirely invisible when she didn't need it. And when she needed it, it was absolute. She had spent the first weeks of understanding this waiting for the condition, for the moment when the protection revealed its price, when Pedro would use what he provided as leverage over what she could become. She had been conditioned to expect that. A year of therapy, and she still flinched at the shape of it in the distance. The condition never came. She asked him once, directly. In the early months of the marriage, sitting across from him at the kitchen table in the configuration that had become the geography of their most honest conversations, whether there was something she was expected to give up. Some part of herself the marriage required her to surrender in exchange for his name and his world. He had looked at her with an expression she now recognized as the one he wore when he found a question, both fair and painful. If I wanted a woman who disappeared into my life, he said, I would have found one. I wanted you, specifically. A pause. That means I wanted everything that comes with you, including the parts that have nothing to do with me. She had believed him then. Sitting at the kitchen table with Isadora's tea warming her hands, watching the morning move through the apartment with its new, settled quality, she believed him more completely. This was what power could look like, she understood now. Not the kind that diminished, not the kind that required your smallness to maintain its size. The other kind, the kind that expanded the space around you rather than contracting it. She was still learning to inhabit that space without apology. Isadora reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over Melissa's. He chose well, the older woman said simply. Then she rose to refill her own cup, the subject apparently closed. That afternoon, Melissa walked to the window and stood looking out over the city for a long time. The streets below moved with their ordinary afternoon energy, people going somewhere, people coming back. A child on a bicycle weaving between pedestrians with the magnificent confidence of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of the space they occupy. She pressed her palm against the window glass, cool and solid beneath her hand. Behind her, she heard Pedro come in from his study. She felt him stop when he saw her at the window, that particular quality of his attention that she had learned to sense before she could see it. He crossed the room and stood beside her, looking out at the same city, shoulder close to hers without touching. They stood like that for a while. I want to meet them properly, she said eventually. Your people, the ones who matter. Pedro looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She turned to face him. I want to. I'm not hiding anymore. She held his gaze steadily. I'm done being a woman who makes herself small enough to fit through spaces someone else decided were the right size for her. Something shifted in Pedro's expression, something that moved behind his eyes like light moving underwater. He nodded once. Then we'll introduce you properly, he said. She turned back to the window. The city looked different from up here, she thought. It always had. But it was beginning, slowly and irrevocably, to look like something that belonged to her too. Then the first pain came, low and sharp and unmistakable. Her hand flew to her stomach. Pedro, she said. His hand was already at her back. The hospital room was very quiet. Not empty, there were nurses, a midwife, a doctor who spoke in the calm and unhurried register of someone who has attended hundreds of these moments and still treats each one with the same focused attention. But quiet in the sense that mattered. No phones, no business, no world outside the room. Pedro had cleared his entire day the moment she said his name at the window. He had not left her side since. She noticed this with a clarity that the intensity of labor somehow sharpened rather than obscured the specific, grounding awareness that he was there, not managing from a distance, not stationed in a waiting room with his phone and his associates. There, in the room, in a chair he had pulled close to the bed, and then abandoned in favor of standing beside her when the hours deepened and the work intensified. He was not comfortable with helplessness. She had learned that about him. He was a man built for action, for decisions, for the controlled application of will toward outcomes. Sitting beside a woman in labor and being unable to do anything except be present was, she understood, one of the harder things she had ever asked him to do without asking. He did it without complaint, without his phone, without once looking toward the door. She reached for his hand during the worst of it, and he gave it to her completely, let her grip it with a force that had nothing restrained about it, said nothing, kept his eyes on her face with the focused, absolute attention of a man who has decided this is the only thing in the world that exists right now. "You're doing it," he said quietly. Not a performance of encouragement. A simple, observed fact. She was doing it. The baby arrived at 10 minutes past 2 in the morning. The sound he made, that first, furious, magnificent announcement of existence, hit the room like something physical, like pressure. Melissa felt it in her sternum and her throat simultaneously, and she was crying before she had processed the fact of crying, tears running freely down her temples and into her hair while she reached for him, and the midwife placed him against her chest, and the world rearranged itself permanently around this new and specific gravity. He was small and warm and absolute. She held him against her and felt his weight, the particular, astonishing realness of it, and could not speak. There were no words that fit the inside of this moment. She had imagined it many times over the past 5 months, had rehearsed in the privacy of her own mind what she might feel, and none of the rehearsals had come close to this. This was the thing itself, unmediated and complete. She looked up. Pedro stood at the side of the bed, very still. He was looking at his son. She had seen Pedro in many configurations over the course of knowing him. Composed, authoritative, quietly furious, tender in the private, careful way he reserved for moments between just the two of them. She had seen him in the warehouse controlled and absolute. She had seen him at the cafe cold with purpose. She had not seen this. His expression was entirely unguarded. The composure that was so fundamental to him, so constitutive of how he moved through the world, had simply gone. Not broken, released, as though he had made a conscious decision that this moment did not require it, that this was a room where he could afford to be seen completely. His jaw worked. His eyes were bright. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked softly. He looked at her, then back at the baby. Then he nodded, a single, wordless movement that contained more than she had ever heard him say. The midwife guided the transfer, and then Pedro had his son in his arms. He held him the way Melissa hadn't expected, not tentatively, not with the stiffness of a man unaccustomed to small things. He held him with the same settled, absolute quality he brought to everything, as though the baby had always belonged in exactly this position, and Pedro's arms had simply been waiting for him to arrive. He looked down at his son's face for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up at Melissa, there were tears on his face. He didn't move to conceal them. He simply let them be there, present and unashamed, in the quiet hospital room at 10 past 2 in the morning. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. But the way he said them encompassed everything: the gallery, the Italian restaurant, the ring, the clinic, the warehouse, the years she had spent believing she was insufficient, and the 1.5 years it had taken to understand she was not. She felt the tears come again. "He has your eyes," she said. Pedro looked back down at the baby. "He has your strength," he said quietly. "I hope." The room settled around them, warm, still, complete. The nurses moved softly at the periphery. Beyond the window, the city continued in its unaware, indifferent way, entirely ignorant of what had just occurred in this room. The arrival of a boy who would grow up knowing, because both his parents had fought their way to understanding it, that power and love were not opposites. That protection could feel like expansion. That the people who love you correctly make you larger, not smaller. Melissa leaned back against the pillow and watched Pedro walk slowly back and forth beside the bed, his son against his chest, speaking to him in a low voice she couldn't quite hear. Something private, something that belonged only to the two of them in the beginning of their knowing each other. She thought about the cafe, the cold latte, Cooper's hand at her throat, the word broken that she had carried so long it had started to feel like her own name. She thought about a bathroom floor and 2 lines on a test, and the sobs that had come from somewhere deeper than grief. She thought about Pedro's hand pressed against her stomach through the wall of her skin, feeling his son move for the first time. She had not escaped into this life. She had built it. From rubble, from shame, from the long and difficult work of deciding that what someone cruel had told her about herself was not the final word on who she was. Pedro turned and found her watching him. He stopped walking, looked at her across the small, quiet room with their son against his chest, and everything they had walked through between them, and said nothing, because there was nothing left that needed saying. She smiled. He smiled back fully, unguarded. the version of him that very few people in the world were permitted to see. She had been strangled in a cafe. She had been told she was broken, defective, insufficient. A woman who had tricked a man into a life she was incapable of giving him. And here, at 2:10 in the morning, she held the disproof of every word, not because a man had rescued her, because she had chosen correctly, had survived long enough to choose correctly, had walked through the right door when it finally opened, and refused to apologize for what she found on the other side. She was Melissa Feliciano, wife, mother, protected, whole, and no one not ever again would dare question her worth. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.
А все равно, как бы, ну, сути дела не меняет, как бы зарплата плюс-минус везде там, ну, больше, чуть меньше. Как бы, и, наверное, это все, вот эта общая ситуация, наверное, у многих привела, во-первых, сфера развлечений, да, всякие там кредиты и так далее, настолько загоняют каждого в задницу человека. И об этом на самом деле никто так-то не говорит. Какое количество сейчас, допустим, даже в те же сложные времена такие, когда вот сейчас идет там специальная военная операция, да, где люди вообще умирают, в принципе, за какую-то сумму денег. Ну, то есть, какая мотивация, то есть, у мужика идти, типа, на войну, воевать и, ну, как бы заработать денег? Потому что он вот в обычной жизни не понимает, типа, как реализовать себя. Ну, он понимает, что он может пойти работать на какую-то работу, где зарплаты его все равно не будет хватать. Как бы тут тоже двойственная сторона. Хорошо, когда она есть, плохо, когда ее нету. Да, вот это маленькая даже зарплаты. Но морально-то ты все равно подавлен. Ты понимаешь, да, я там пойду туда, но как бы смысла мне этого не принесет большого. Да, у меня там станет, если я вообще не работаю и буду работать за 50 тысяч, хорошо, что они у меня есть, я смогу там покушать себе купить, но это же дизмораль. Когда ты заходишь в интернет и видишь, как люди там в Дубае летают, покупают себе огромное количество автомобилей какие-то, ну, много всего такого, что ты за эту зарплату себе никогда в жизни позволить не сможешь. И как человеку оставаться морально, типа, сильным? Что ему нужно делать? Ну, наверное, во-первых, это, наверное, все от семьи исходит, да? То есть, какая семья у тебя, как она построена. Если ты один живешь, это сложно, да, ты будешь сам себя, но у тебя, опять-таки, возможно, ну, родители, если есть, которые друзья поддержат тебя в какой-то момент, хотя бы просто отвлекут тебя от этих мыслей. А если у тебя, к примеру, там, семья, жена, к примеру, да, есть дети, то тут, наверное, поддержка только от них исходит какая-то. Вот. Чтобы не упиваться в своих мыслях о том, что какая нынче сложная жизнь. И, наверное, других-то вариантов, в принципе-то, и нету. Какие вот еще варианты, в принципе, изменить, поменять свою жизнь настолько, чтобы она была, ну, казалась тебе удачной, да, реализованным себя в жизни, в чем-то. В чем, вот как проявляется на самом деле у нас реализованность? Наверное, у 90% случаев это финансовое благополучие, финансовая независимость. Это, наверное, одно из таких ключевых моментов, когда человек, наверное, считает себя реализованным, да, в этой жизни. То есть, как добиться этого? То есть, с учетом того, что даже возьмем нашу страну, да, сколько миллионов людей здесь живет, как каждому добиться этого результата? Непонятно. И с каждым годом просто ситуация становится все хуже и хуже. Все дорожает, люди зарабатывают либо столько же. Ну, даже если они зарабатывают столько же, на самом деле этого все уже недостаточно. К чему это все приведет на самом деле? В оконцове, наверное, мир погрязнет в большую депрессию в какую-то. Какие-то войны, возможно, или еще что-то еще больше глобальных таких вещей, которые не приведут ни к чему хорошему на самом деле. Поддержка каждого человека именно для того, чтобы он держался, наверное, морально, заключается в том, что, ну, наверное, дом, в который ты приходишь, должен быть крепостью твоей, да, что это единственное должно быть место, где ты будешь чувствовать себя под защитой. Для этого было и придумано, наверное, своя пещера изначально, потом свои какие-то чумы, палатки различные, да, потом все это превратилось, на данный момент это у нас дома, квартиры, в которые мы приходим и должны ощущать себя в безопасности, чтобы можно быть немного морально расслабленным с учетом того, что ты выходишь каждый день на работу, на улицу, и все равно давление вот это вот, оно все равно присутствует. Когда ты заходишь в магазин, видишь цены эти, да, и так далее, не можешь себе что-то там приобрести, позволить на ежедневной основе, это откладывает большой, наверное, отпечаток. Не, наверное, а точно. И поэтому, когда возвращаясь домой, ты чувствуешь, вот хотя бы есть типа уголок того места, куда ты можешь прийти. Уголок на самом деле человеку много тоже не надо. Можно хотеть большего, но на самом деле человеку одному много не надо. Да? Ему нужно спальное место, спокойное место, где можно подумать. Ну, это когда ты один, к примеру, да? Когда у тебя есть семья, к примеру, ты приходишь домой, опять-таки, тут хотя бы, да, поговорить о каких-то вещах. Просто об отрешенных вещах, наверное. И, возможно, при этих же условиях у тебя и появляется какая-то дополнительная мотивация для реализации себя. А когда у тебя нету ничего, вот это уже становится проблемой. И это у многих на самом деле. Что значит не иметь ничего? Тут, наверное, самое главное, дизмораль у человека еще возникает при том, что это уже, наверное, где-то в глубине души даже она возникает при даже хорошей финансовой подушке такой, которая у тебя есть, хороших финансовых деньгах, да, то есть, но нету вот внутреннего ощущения, к примеру, дружбы, семьи, любви и так далее. Это уже отдельно на самом деле разговор, потому что мы, вот, к примеру, можем взять, как сейчас вот Мелстрой, если кто-то смотрит, насколько тяжело обладать такими финансами и не иметь, по сути, ничего. Ни друзей, ничего не иметь. Так главное, это получается для бедных главное деньги, для богатых главное какое-то внутреннее ощущение нужности, не из-за денег. Вот такое вот. И это борьба какая-то такая и вот эти два слоя общества, богатые и бедные, они друг друга не понимают. На самом деле из-за этого, возможно. Потому что богатый человек, он уже не смотрит на деньги, Он не считает эти деньги. Ему важно внутреннее вот это вот ощущение того, что он нужен без них даже. Это как Тони Старку сказали: а кто ты без костюма? На вот это я филантроп, тудым-сюдым, тудым-сюдым, он сказал, да? Так и человеку, у которого много денег, ты задашь вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Ну, что ты представляешь себе без денег? Вот и это, наверное, возможно, таких людей богатых, как вот, например, там Мелстрой, задав ему этот вопрос: а кто ты без денег? Он на него ответить-то и не сможет. Обратная сторона людей бедных, да, вот если мы посмотрим, человеку